Hey everybody, what's going on? This is Sam from Historic Travels and welcome to another video. And as always, before we get started today, I'd just like to take a quick moment to welcome all my new subs and to thank everybody who's been leaving me comments and messages down below. Thank you all so much, I really appreciate it. And if you would like to take a couple extra steps to help support the channel a little bit more, there's a merch store and a Patreon for this channel in the links below. Thank you all so much for all your support. Alright guys, well hey, you all voted for it, so that's the video you all are going to get. For today's video, we're going to be telling the story of the RMS Carpathia and the role that this ship played on the night that the RMS Titanic went down. Now, just to clarify here, we're not going to be telling the complete story of the Carpathia in this video, meaning the entire life of the ship. We're only going to focus on what happened to the Carpathia and the role that it played on the night that the Titanic sank. Alright guys, well hey, without any further ado, let's now tell the tale of the RMS Carpathia.
The RMS Carpathia was a passenger ocean liner developed and built by the Cunard Line and officially entered service in the year 1903. The Carpathia was a well-liked vessel, and everybody who sailed on the ship said it was one of the most comfortable vessels that they had ever sailed on. Now, the reason the Carpathia is so famous today is because the Carpathia was the first ship to arrive at the location at which the RMS Titanic went down. And it was the Carpathia that was responsible for rescuing all the survivors from the Titanic disaster.
Now, anybody who studies the Titanic disaster already knows that the Carpathia was the ship to respond to the Titanic's distress call, and ultimately was the ship to go and rescue the Titanic survivors after the Titanic went down. However, most people don't know the full story of the Carpathia and what events occurred that allowed the Carpathia to be able to respond to the Titanic's distress call in the first place. Did you know that it was somewhat of a miracle that the Carpathia even heard the Titanic's distress call at all? So, for the rest of this video, I'm now going to go over the series of events that occurred with the Carpathia that ultimately allowed it to be the rescuer of all the people who were on board the Titanic during its final night afloat.
It is Sunday, April 14th, 1912, 11:46 p.m. The RMS Titanic has just struck an iceberg on the starboard side below the waterline and is now slowly beginning to sink. At this early stage in the sinking, everybody on board the Titanic would not yet know how serious of a situation they were in. However, it wouldn't take long before everybody on board the Titanic found out that the damage to the Titanic from the iceberg impact was worse than they could possibly imagine. At the exact same time all of this was going on with the Titanic, the RMS Carpathia was steaming east from New York City, bound for a city called Rijeka, located in the country of Croatia. However, it's important to note that in 1912, this same city was called Fiume, and it was part of the country of Austria at the time.
Now, there are two people on board the RMS Carpathia that would play a crucial role in getting the Carpathia to the Titanic's position on the night of the sinking. If it wasn't for these two people, then it's very possible that the Carpathia wouldn't have even known that the Titanic was in trouble. The first person you need to be aware of is the Carpathia's captain, a man by the name of Arthur Rostron. His actions on board the RMS Carpathia on the night that the Titanic went down are a big reason why the Carpathia was able to respond to the Titanic disaster so quickly. And the second person you need to be aware of who was on board the Carpathia was the Carpathia's wireless radio operator, a man by the name of Harold Cottam. It's thanks to him that the Carpathia was even aware of the dangerous situation the Titanic was in. If it wasn't for Harold Cottam, then the Carpathia would have never known that the Titanic was sinking until it was long too late to help anybody who was on board the doomed liner.
Now, the Titanic's first distress signal left the vessel at roughly 12:27 a.m. on Monday, April 15th, 1912. Now, at the time that the Titanic began sending out this distress signal, the Carpathia was located roughly 58 nautical miles away from the Titanic. Now, even though it was this far away, it was well within range of the Titanic's radio system. However, the Carpathia at this time did not pick up any of the distress calls from the Titanic. This is because Harold Cottam's shift on the Carpathia's radio system had ended about 30 minutes before. So, at the time that the Titanic began broadcasting a distress signal, Harold Cottam was on the Carpathias Bridge having a conversation with some of the Carpathias Bridge officers. However, as luck would have it, when Harold Cottam returned to the wireless room and began locking everything up before he went to bed, he decided to turn on the Carpathia's radio system one final time and listen to any messages out there to see if he could hear what was going on this particular evening. And it's because he decided to do this, he heard the distress call from the Titanic and was able to respond to this dangerous situation that the Titanic was in.
At roughly 12:34 a.m., Harold Cottam switched back back on the RMS Carpathia's radio system and began listening to messages traveling across the Atlantic. Now, at this time, he still didn't hear any distress calls from the Titanic, but what he did hear was that Cape Cod, Massachusetts had a lot of private messages that it was trying to send to the RMS Titanic. These messages would have most likely been messages for some of the Titanic's passengers from family members back home. Now, when the Carpathia's wireless operator, Harold Cottam, heard these messages, he tried to contact the Titanic just to let them know, hey, Cape Cod's got a bunch of messages for you. Now, before Harold Cottam had even finished sending this message, Jack Phillips, the wireless radio operator on board the Titanic, heard the Carpathia sending this message, and Jack Phillips interrupted Harold Cottam and said, come at once, we are sinking. This is a CQD, old man. Now, whenever you hear Jack Phillips say the word old man, this was basically a slang term that Jack Phillips used whenever he was talking to his friend Harold Cottam. Harold Cottam and Jack Phillips were friends with each other, and they always liked to use the phrase old man whenever they were communicating with each other. Now, Harold Cottam heard this message, and he asked the Titanic operator Jack Phillips, should I contact my captain? At which Jack Phillips said, yes, come at once. So at this point, Harold Cottam rushed to the bridge of the Carpathia to let them know of what he had just learned about the horrible situation that was unfolding on board the RMS Titanic. Once Harold Cottam received a distress call from the Titanic, he immediately rushed to the Carpathias Bridge to let the bridge officers there know what was going on with the RMS Titanic. Now, it's important to note that at the time Harold Cottam received the Titanic's distress call and ran to the bridge, it was roughly 12:41 a.m. on board the Carpathia. By this time, the Carpathia's captain had already retired for the evening and he was in bed. The only people on the Carpathia's bridge at this time were the Carpathia's bridge officers. Now, when Harold Cottam made it to the Carpathia's bridge, he began to freak out and he began telling everybody on the bridge, the Titanic is sinking, we have to go and help. Now, when the Carpathia's bridge officers heard this, they literally just looked at Harold and laughed at him. They said, the Titanic isn't sinking, someone is pulling a joke on you. Believe it or not, at this point in time, there were already jokesters using Marconi wireless technology to send out fake SOS calls from other ships pretending these ships were sinking in order to try to pull jokes on other ships. So basically in 1912, there were trolls on Marconi wireless, just like we have trolls on the internet today. People never change. Even 100 years ago, people were basically the same as they are now, which is crazy. But because Harold Cottam knew the slang term that Jack Phillips had used with him, he knew that this wasn't a joke. He knew that this was his friend, and he would not be sending this message unless the Titanic was in real trouble. So Harold Cottam didn't see the point in to try and reason with the bridge officers. So at this point, he rushed to the captain's cabin in order to tell him what was going on with the RMS Titanic.
Now, when Harold Cottam left the Carpathia's bridge, the bridge officers on board the Carpathia grew very concerned, because at this point in time, they thought the whole idea that the Titanic was sinking was still a joke. And then they saw Harold run off of the bridge and head for the captain's cabin, so a few of the bridge officers decided to run after him to try to stop him from waking up the captain. But by then it didn't matter. It didn't take Harold very long to reach the captain's cabin on the Carpathia, at which point Harold didn't even bother to knock on the captain's door. He literally broke into the captain's cabin and told him about what was going on with the Titanic. Now, at the exact moment Harold broke into the captain's cabin, at this time, Arthur Rostron was asleep in his bed. So, when Harold broke in, it immediately woke up Arthur, and as you can imagine, he was pretty annoyed with his wireless operator for breaking into his cabin. He literally said to Harold, "What are you doing? Why did you break in here? Haven't you ever heard of knocking?" But Harold interrupted him and told him what was going on with the Titanic. Now, right after this, some of the Carpathia's bridge officers finally arrived at the captain's cabin, at which point they proceeded to apologize to the captain for not stopping Harold. But Arthur didn't say anything to the bridge officer. Instead, he just looked back at Harold and said, "Are you sure this is from the Titanic?" Harold said yes. Arthur then said, "Are you sure they're in trouble?" Once again, Harold said yes. So then Arthur told Harold to tell the Titanic that they were coming to them at full steam ahead. He then turned to the bridge officer and told them to bring the ship about and have it head towards the Titanic as quickly as possible.
Now, I will say, props to Arthur for being able to handle that situation the way he did. There aren't that many people out there who would be able to handle a situation like that just after being so rudely woken up. Because, I mean, think about it. If somebody rudely wakes you up, you're usually all anger for the first few seconds that you're awake, and you're not thinking very logically and clearly. But still, upon hearing what Harold Cottam had to say, Arthur immediately snapped out of it and let his anger go and began dealing with the situation on hand just like any captain should. So honestly, Arthur gets my praise for being an awesome captain. Good job, man. But yeah, as soon as Harold Cottam left the captain's cabin and headed back to the Marconi room, they began to try to figure out the Carpathia's position and began to message back the Titanic, letting them know that they were on their way. The Carpathia sent another message to the Titanic at roughly 12:49 a.m., letting the Titanic know that the Carpathia was steaming towards the Titanic at all possible speed. However, it would still be around 4 hours or so before the Carpathia would be able to reach the Titanic's position.
Now, with the Carpathia being roughly 4 hours away from the Titanic's position, we all know now that the Carpathia would not make it to the Titanic in time. At the time that the Titanic received the message from the Carpathia letting it know that the ship was on its way to help, the Titanic had only 90 minutes left before the ship would go down. However, at the time, Jack Phillips and Harold Brad, the Titanic's radio operators, didn't know this, but they did know that the Carpathia was pretty far away. So once they learned the Carpathia was coming, they continued to send the Titanic's distress call to see if they could reach another ship that was closer to the Titanic, and maybe, just maybe, that ship could make it to the Titanic before the ship went down. And the whole time that they were doing this, Harold Cottam on the Carpathia was listening to the Titanic's distress call, and he was seeing if another vessel would be able to make it to the Titanic before the Carpathia could.
Alright everybody, so hey, I hate to do this, but I think this is the place where I need to pause the Carpathia story for now, so be sure you tune in next time to part 2, when we finish the story of the RMS Carpathia and its role on what it did for everybody on board the RMS Titanic on the night that the Titanic went down. I really wanted to put the entire story of the Carpathia into one video, however, the more I worked on it, the more I realized that there is a lot of detail with the Carpathia story that I want to share with you guys, so it will be better if I combine it into 2 parts, so just stand by for that. Alright everybody, well hey, thank you all so much for watching. Be sure to leave a like, be sure to subscribe, and hey, keep doing what y'all are doing. Y'all are awesome. Alright everybody, well hey, y'all stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next one. Have a good day everybody, and thank you all so much for all the support.
Special thanks to our captain level Patreon supporters, Olivia Julius, Canadian, Greg Gatlick, and Callum Whaley. Thank you all so much for all the support.